Imagine it is the year 1718. You are standing on a sun-bleached dock in Nassau, the Bahamas, barefoot, broke, and starving. Behind you is a colonial port town that has already chewed you up and spat you out. Your last employer, a merchant shipping company, paid you 4 shillings for 3 months of back-breaking labor, then docked your wages for a torn sail you didn't tear. The magistrate laughed when you complained. The church didn't answer. And the crown, the glorious British crown that supposedly governs this paradise, couldn't care less whether you live or die. Then someone taps you on the shoulder. He is a rough-looking man with sun-cracked skin, a scar running from his left ear to his chin, and eyes that have seen things you cannot yet imagine. He doesn't say much. He just slides a piece of paper across a barrel toward you and places a quill next to it. At the top of the page, written in a surprisingly careful hand, are 2 words: Articles of Agreement. You pick it up, you read it, and what you find inside is something that will shatter every assumption you've ever had about pirates. Because here is the truth that Hollywood has spent 300 years burying under a mountain of romanticized nonsense, swashbuckling heroes, and Johnny Depp stumbling across a deck with a bottle of rum. The truth that historians have documented in court records, captain's logs, and the testimonies of captured pirates who sat in chains before judges and described in methodical and horrifying detail exactly what life was like on those ships. It was not freedom. It was not adventure. It was, by almost every measurable standard of human experience, one of the most brutal, psychologically devastating, and statistically lethal existences a human being in the early 18th century could voluntarily choose, and for many, it wasn't even a choice. This is the story of what life was really like on a pirate ship. Not the legend, not the myth, the reality, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, of what it meant to sign that document, step onto that deck, and surrender your fate to the open ocean and the men who ruled it. But before we get to the horrors that awaited them on board, and trust me, we will get there, we need to understand something fundamental, something that historians often gloss over because it complicates the clean narrative of pirates either as romantic heroes or pure criminals. Most pirates didn't want to be pirates. Let that sit for a moment. When we examined the court depositions from the great piracy trials of the early 1700s, the trial of Bartholomew Roberts' crew in 1722, the trial of Blackbeard's surviving men, the documented accounts from the Boston Newsletter and the American Weekly Mercury, a pattern emerges with striking consistency. The majority of men who ended up on pirate ships were not bold adventurers who chose the life with open eyes and rebellious hearts. They were merchant sailors, naval press gang victims, indentured laborers, and destitute dock workers who found themselves on those ships through a combination of coercion, desperation, and circumstances so narrow that saying yes to a pirate captain was often the least terrible option available to them. The Royal Navy of the early 18th century was, by modern standards, a floating concentration camp with better uniforms. Press gangs, government-sanctioned kidnapping squads, roamed port towns in England, Ireland, and the American colonies, grabbing men off the streets and forcing them into naval service with zero compensation for their former lives, their families, or their possessions. Merchant ships weren't much better. Captains had near absolute authority. Flogging was standard discipline. Food was deliberately rationed below sustenance levels to maximize profit margins, and sailors who died at sea were simply listed as cargo losses in the ship's ledger. So when a pirate ship pulled alongside your merchant vessel, seized it, and then offered you a choice, join us or we'll put you back on this miserable ship with slightly less cargo, the calculus was not as simple as it sounds. But here is where the story gets complicated, and this is the first real twist. Because that Articles of Agreement document, that death contract, as some historians have come to call it, was not just a recruitment form. It was something genuinely radical, something so structurally unusual for its time that when modern legal scholars have analyzed it, they have described it without irony as one of the earliest examples of a democratic labor contract in Western history. Read that again. A democratic labor contract on a pirate ship.
The Articles of Agreement, used by virtually every organized pirate crew during the Golden Age of piracy, roughly 1680 to 1730, laid out in explicit terms the rights and responsibilities of every man on board. Bartholomew Roberts' articles, one of the best preserved examples we have, stipulated the following. Every crew member received an equal vote in major decisions. The captain and quartermaster received slightly larger shares of plunder, but every man received a guaranteed cut. Compensation was provided for injuries. Lose a right arm, 600 pieces of 8. Lose a left arm, 500. Lose an eye, 100. Lights out at 8 o'clock to prevent fires. No gambling on board. No bringing women aboard disguised as men. Musicians were entitled to rest on Sundays. These were not the rules of a lawless mob. These were the rules of a functioning, if brutal and illegal, micro-democracy operating on the high seas at a time when the concept of workers' rights didn't exist anywhere else on Earth. So why then do we call it a death contract? Because of everything the document didn't tell you. Act 2. The ship itself. A wooden box of disease, darkness, and despair. Let's talk about the ship, not as a romantic symbol of freedom sailing against a golden horizon. Let's talk about it as a physical object, a structure, a workplace and a home that hundreds of men were expected to live, eat, sleep, fight, and die inside, sometimes for months at a stretch, without ever seeing land. A typical pirate sloop of the early 1700s, the most common vessel used during the Golden Age, was between 60 and 100 feet long and perhaps 25 feet wide at its broadest point. Picture, for scale, a modern city bus. Now picture 50 to 150 men living inside that bus, in the tropics, without running water, refrigeration, ventilation, or plumbing of any kind. The lower decks, where the crew lived and slept, had headroom of approximately 4.5 to 5 feet. The average man of the period stood around 5 feet 6 inches. This means that for the entirety of his time below deck, every man on that ship was bent at the waist, every single moment. The long-term spinal and muscular damage this caused has been documented in skeletal remains of sailors recovered from shipwrecks across the Caribbean and Atlantic. The sleeping arrangements were hammocks, canvas slings that hung from the ceiling beams, typically 14 inches apart. 14 inches. You could not turn over in your hammock without touching the man next to you. In a crew of 100 men, there might be 60 hammocks because the rest of the crew was always supposed to be on watch, working the rigging or manning the guns. Sleep was not a guaranteed right. It was rationed in 4-hour intervals, grabbed when you could, and interrupted constantly by the demands of the ship. And the smell.
we need to talk about the smell because it is central to understanding the psychological toll of this life in a way that no other detail quite captures. The bilge, the lowest section of the ship's hull where water collected, was a permanent reservoir of seawater, human waste, rotting food, dead rats, and the accumulated biological runoff of 100 human beings. It was never fully emptied. It was pumped occasionally to prevent sinking, but the organic matter it contained simply festered in the tropical heat, producing gases that permeated every level of the ship. Sailors described the smell as a living thing, something that entered you when you breathed and stayed there. Visitors to reconstructed ships today, even clean and museum-ready ones, still report an almost physical revulsion from the lingering structural memory of that decay. Then there were the rats.
Every ship was infested with them. Not occasionally, permanently, comprehensively, at population levels that would be classified as an ecological crisis today. Rats consumed provisions, contaminated water supplies, spread fleas, and bit sleeping sailors. Ship's cats were kept specifically to manage rat populations, but on most vessels, the rats won. They were simply too numerous, too fast-breeding, and too deeply embedded in the ship's structure to be eradicated. Men learned to sleep through the sensation of rats running across their bodies. Those who couldn't override that instinctive revulsion were considered weak. The sea demanded a particular kind of psychological hardening that we, in our climate-controlled, pest-free world, can barely begin to comprehend. But the rats, the smell, and the cramped quarters were not the most dangerous thing about the ship. The most dangerous thing was the food. The provisions carried on a pirate ship during a long voyage were, by modern nutritional standards, barely compatible with human survival. The staple foods were hardtack, dense brick-like biscuits made from flour and water, baked until they could survive months without refrigeration, and salt pork or salt beef preserved in brine so concentrated that eating it without extended soaking first could accelerate dehydration to dangerous levels. Hardtack biscuits were, after even a few weeks at sea, universally infested with weevil larvae and mealworms. A sailor's standard practice was to tap the biscuit sharply on the table before eating it, then eat quickly in the dark so you couldn't see what remained. Contemporary accounts from naval sailors, and there is no reason to believe pirate vessels were different, describe eating handfuls of moving food as something you simply learned to do. The alternative was starvation. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels that began to grow algae and bacteria within days. By the third week of a voyage, the water was typically green, thick, and foul-smelling. Sailors mixed it with alcohol, rum, beer, wine, not primarily for intoxication, but to mask the taste and kill some of the microbial content. The result was that most sailors maintained a low-level, constant state of mild intoxication, which was not a perk of the lifestyle, but a medical necessity of hydration. Scurvy was the great killer of long ocean voyages, caused by vitamin C deficiency, a cause not scientifically confirmed until 1932, though empirically suspected much earlier. Scurvy produced symptoms that read today like something from a horror novel. First came the fatigue and the joint pain, so severe that men could not climb rigging. Then the gums began to bleed and swell, loosening teeth from their sockets. Old wounds, healed scars from years past, would reopen spontaneously as the collagen holding them together dissolved. Men reported eating injuries they had sustained a decade earlier would split open and begin bleeding as though fresh.
The psychological effect of watching your own body literally come undone, of feeling your past wounds resurface, was documented by numerous sailors as more terrifying than any combat they had experienced.
In severe cases, the skin turned black and began to die. Men in the final stages of scurvy could not stand, could not eat, could not speak coherently, and would often hallucinate. On a long voyage with no citrus, no fresh vegetables, and no understanding of the cause, an entire crew could be reduced to this state within 8 to 12 weeks. Act 3. The hierarchy of violence. Who really ruled the ship and what they did with that power? Here is the paradox at the heart of pirate society that most people never fully grasp because it requires holding two contradictory truths. On one hand, pirate ships were, as we established, the most democratically organized vessels on the ocean. The captain was elected. He could be voted out. Major decisions, whether to attack a target, where to sail, how to divide the plunder, required crew consensus. The quartermaster, elected separately, served specifically as a check on the captain's power, representing the crew's interests in disputes. This was extraordinary. On Royal Navy ships and merchant vessels, the captain was a god. On a pirate ship, he was more like a CEO who served at the board's pleasure. On the other hand, this democracy operated within a framework of violence so normalized, so casually brutal, that it would constitute multiple war crimes by modern international law. The Articles guaranteed rights, but the Articles also specified in equally explicit terms the punishments for violating them. And those punishments were not abstract. They were carried out on the deck, in front of the crew, with a methodical thoroughness that served both as justice and psychological conditioning. Marooning, perhaps the most psychologically cruel punishment in pirate arsenal, was reserved for the worst offenses: theft from fellow crew members, cowardice in battle, or serious violations of the Articles. A man sentenced to marooning was rowed to the nearest uninhabited island or sandbar, given a pistol with a single shot, the mercy being that he could choose to end his own life rather than die of dehydration, and left. The crew then sailed away. Think about what that moment felt like. You have watched your ship, your entire world, your only connection to other human beings, your only means of survival, shrink to a speck on the horizon and then disappear. You are alone in a way that almost no modern human has ever been alone. The pistol in your hand feels extraordinarily heavy. Of the documented marooning cases in pirate history, virtually none ended in survival. The men either died of dehydration within days, shot themselves, or, in a few cases, were found by passing ships who recognized the custom and understood what it meant. But marooning was the exceptional punishment. The everyday violence of life on a pirate ship was less dramatic and more constant. Fights were constant. Pack 100 men, many of them already psychologically damaged by previous lives of poverty, naval abuse, or violence, into a confined space with no privacy, inadequate food, chronic low-level intoxication, and the constant proximity of death, and you create conditions that behavioral psychologists today would recognize as a pressure cooker for aggression. The Articles prohibited fighting on board and mandated that disputes be resolved on shore through formalized duel. In practice, this rule was widely ignored. Knives were the most common weapons in shipboard conflicts. Broken bottles were a close second. The quartermaster, whose job was to maintain order, wielded authority through a combination of physical intimidation and social respect. The
The best quartermasters, men like William Maine aboard Bartholomew Roberts' ship, were described in court testimonies as having an almost preternatural ability to de-escalate, to appear at precisely the right moment and say precisely the right thing to prevent a minor argument from becoming a fatal one. They were, in essence, the ship's therapists, social workers, and police force simultaneously, armed and willing to use force if de-escalation failed. But it is in the relationship between the crew and their captain that the deepest psychological complexity of pirate life reveals itself. The great pirate captains of the Golden Age were not simply violent thugs who happened to own ships. They were, almost uniformly, psychological operators of remarkable sophistication, men who understood, with an intuition that predated modern leadership theory by 2 centuries, that authority on a democratic ship had to be earned continuously through a combination of competence, charisma, and carefully deployed terror. Blackbeard, Edward Teach or Thatch of Bristol, understood this better than almost anyone. His famous appearance, the enormous black beard twisted into braids, the slow-burning fuses woven into his hair during battle, producing smoke and the smell of sulfur around his face, was a deliberate psychological construction. He was creating a character, a living nightmare in human form. And it worked not just on the merchant sailors he terrorized, but on his own crew, who understood that a man who would make himself look like the literal devil was a man who had fully committed to a kind of madness that made him unpredictable and therefore dangerous to cross. Contemporary accounts describe his crew as genuinely afraid of him and genuinely devoted to him, a combination that sounds contradictory but is psychologically coherent. Fear, when paired with perceived competence and protection from external threats, produces intense loyalty. It is the same dynamic that drives cult followings, certain military units, and toxic corporate hierarchies. You are afraid of the person above you, but more afraid of what the world without them would be. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, operated differently. He was cold, almost puritanical in his personal habits. He didn't drink, kept strict order, and reportedly despised disorder of any kind. But his tactical brilliance was so overwhelming, he captured over 400 ships in a career spanning less than 4 years, a record that has never been approached, that his authority rested primarily on the crew's rational assessment that following him made them more likely to be alive and wealthy tomorrow than any alternative. These were not simple men. They were not simple stories, and the men who followed them were not simple either. Act 4. The Battle and its Aftermath. What combat actually cost. Here is what the movies always get wrong about pirate combat, and it matters because getting it right completely reframes what we understand about the psychology of these men. Most pirate attacks never involved significant combat at all. The entire strategic logic of piracy was built around the avoidance of sustained battle. A pirate crew attacking a merchant ship was not trying to win a fight, it was trying to prevent one from happening. The standard approach was to fly false colors, a national flag that matched the target's allegiance, designed to get close without alarm. Then, at the last possible moment, run up the pirate flag, the Jolly Roger, and fire a warning shot across the bow. The Jolly Roger's purpose was not theatrical. It was a specific, understood communication. Surrender now, and we will take your cargo and leave you alive. Resist, and we will give no quarter. The The flag was a business tool, a negotiating instrument. Most merchant captains faced with this choice surrendered. The pirate crew boarded, took what they wanted, occasionally recruited willing crew members from the merchant ship, and left. The whole operation might take 2 hours. No one died. The pirates got their plunder, the merchants got to go home. But when it didn't work that way, when a merchant captain was stubborn or frightened or had received orders from his company not to surrender, the results were catastrophic.
Naval combat in the Age of Sail was not the choreographed sword-fighting spectacle of popular imagination. It was close-quarters industrial slaughter. Cannons firing at ranges of 50 to 100 yards did not simply punch clean holes in ships. They sent enormous wooden splinters traveling at near ballistic speeds in every direction. Splinter wounds were the primary cause of combat death and injury in naval battle, not cannonball strikes. A single cannon shot hitting a wooden hull could produce hundreds of splinters, each one capable of puncturing a lung, severing a limb, or embedding itself so deeply in muscle and bone that extraction was impossible without killing the patient. The ship's surgeon, if there was one, operated on a wooden table below decks while the battle raged above him. The standard treatment for a badly damaged limb was immediate amputation, conducted without anesthesia. Alcohol was used as a mild depressant but provided negligible pain relief for surgery, with a bone saw that was rarely properly sterilized. The surgery had to be completed in under 4 minutes because longer than that and the patient almost always died of shock. The article's injury compensation table, 600 pieces of 8 for a lost arm, was not a hypothetical provision. It was a frequently claimed benefit. The psychological effects of combat on pirate crews have been documented in ways that modern psychologists recognize immediately as symptoms of what we now call PTSD. Men who had survived prolonged engagements described auditory hallucinations of cannon fire in the weeks following battle. Violent nightmares were considered normal and unremarkable, so normal that there was no word for them in the sailors' vocabulary, no framework for understanding them as a medical condition. They were simply part of the experience, folded into the background noise of a life that was already saturated with trauma. Act 5. The Democracy's Dark Secret. What the articles never said. We have to return to that document because there is something in it, or rather, something deliberately left out of it, that represents the final, most devastating truth about life on a pirate ship. The Articles of Agreement was a contract, and like all contracts, its power resided not just in what it promised, but in what it could actually deliver. And what it could actually deliver was constrained by one inescapable fact. You were at sea. All the democratic rights in the world meant nothing if the ship was sinking. All the injury compensation in the world meant nothing if the surgeon was dead. All the guaranteed shares of plunder meant nothing if the plunder was at the bottom of the ocean, or if the king's pardon you'd been promised turned out to be fraudulent, or if the colonial governor who had been secretly taking bribes from your crew for 3 years suddenly found it politically convenient to have you hanged. The hanging of pirates was not a sporadic event. It was, in the period between 1716 and 1726, an industrial process. Governor Woodes Rogers arrived in Nassau in 1718 with a royal pardon that pardoned all pirates who surrendered, and a set of gallows already under construction on the beach. The message was simultaneously merciful and unambiguous. Over the following decade, hundreds of men who had served on pirate ships were tried and executed across the Atlantic world, in London, Boston, Nassau, Cape Coast Castle, and Williamsburg. The trials were conducted with remarkable speed. The executions were public, deliberate, and designed as spectacle. The
The bodies of executed pirates were often gibbeted, displayed in iron cages along harbor approaches as warnings to sailors considering the life. The most chilling execution of the era was the mass hanging of 52 members of Bartholomew Roberts' crew at Cape Coast Castle, Ghana, in April 1922, the largest mass execution in pirate history. Roberts himself had been killed weeks earlier, shot through the throat from grape shot from the HMS Swallow while standing at his ship's stern in a crimson vestwit, having apparently decided that if he was going to die, he would die dressed well. His crew, many of whom had not chosen the pirate life but been pressed into it from captured merchant ships, died on the gallows of a fort on the West African coast, thousands of miles from home, for a choice, in many cases, that had never truly been theirs to make. Act 6. The ones who chose it anyway, and why that makes the story even more complicated.
We've spent this entire documentary cataloging the horrors of pirate life, and every horror we have described is documented, verified, and real. But we would be doing a disservice to history and to the men themselves if we ended there. Because some of them chose it, genuinely, knowingly, with full awareness of the risks. And understanding why they chose it tells us something profound about the world they lived in and, uncomfortably, about the world we live in now. For a man at the absolute bottom of the early 18th century social order, a pressed naval seaman, a runaway indentured servant, an enslaved man who had escaped his bondage and found his way to a pirate port, the pirate ship, for all its horrors, represented something that the legitimate world had categorically refused to offer him: agency. On a merchant ship or a Royal Navy vessel, you were property. Your labor was owned. Your body was the crown's asset. You could be beaten, starved, worked to death, and your family would receive nothing. The law that was supposed to protect you was written by and for the men who owned you. On a pirate ship, you voted. Your injury was compensated. Your share was guaranteed by contract. If the captain was incompetent or cruel beyond the bounds of the articles, you could vote him out and elect someone else. If you wanted to leave, you could, theoretically, at the next port. These were not small things. These were revolutionary things. In a world of absolute hierarchy, the pirate ship was, in its strange and violent and ultimately doomed way, a pocket of radical equality. Historians have documented that pirate crews were among the most racially integrated organizations in the Atlantic world during the Golden Age. Black sailors, some free, some escaped from slavery, served on pirate crews as full members, voting and receiving equal shares at a time when chattel slavery was the defining institution of the colonial economy. The Black Caesar legend, the documented existence of African pirate captains in the Indian Ocean, the testimony from trials showing black crew members receiving equal shares of plunder. All of this represents something that we rarely talk about when we talk about piracy, because it complicates the simple narrative of pirates as simply criminals. They were criminals. They were also, by the standards of their time and place, something close to revolutionary. Act 7, the final accounting. What the numbers actually say. Let's end with the numbers, because the numbers are where the romantic mythology of piracy finally, completely collapses. The average career of a Golden Age pirate lasted less than 2 years. In that time, the statistical probability of dying from disease was higher than the probability of dying in combat. The probability of being captured and executed was approximately 1 in 3 for anyone active in the Caribbean after 1718. The probability of retiring with enough wealth to live comfortably, the dream sold on that Nassau dock, the promise written between the lines of the Articles of Agreement, was, according to economic historian Marcus Rediker's analysis, statistically close to 0.
Of the hundreds of documented pirate captains from the Golden Age, fewer than a handful died wealthy of natural causes. The vast majority died by hanging, by battle, by disease, by the hands of their own crew, or by drowning in the ships they had staked everything to sail. Blackbeard was killed in brutal hand-to-hand combat at Ocracoke Inlet in 1718, his body reportedly requiring 5 gunshot wounds and more than 20 sword cuts before he fell. Bartholomew Roberts was shot dead in 1722. Calico Jack Rackham was hanged in Jamaica in 1720, his body displayed in an iron gibbet at the harbor entrance as a warning for years afterwards. And the ordinary men, the ones whose names never made the history books, who signed the articles on a desperate day in Nassau or Port Royal or Tortuga and disappeared into the ship's manifest, most of them simply vanished, died without record, buried at sea or in unmarked graves in colonial ports, their names preserved only in court records where they appear as evidence against someone else, or in the ship's articles where they are listed as a fraction of the plunder divide. They came looking for the only thing the legitimate world had refused to give them: a fair share, a vote, some dignity, some small measure of control over their own lives. And some of them found it, briefly, in the only place it was available to them, on the wrong side of the law, on the open ocean, in a rotting wooden ship that smelled of death and rang with the sound of rats in the dark. They signed a contract that promised them equality. They boarded a ship that guaranteed them misery. They sailed into a world that was determined to destroy them. And they did it anyway, because for men with nothing, a floating hell with a vote was still better than a stable world that didn't see them at all. That is the real history of piracy. Not the legend, not the flag, not the rum. The contract, the hunger, the rats in the dark, and the men who signed anyway. The Golden Age of piracy officially ended in 1730. The last pirate to be executed under British law was William Fly, hanged in Boston in 1726. He refused a blindfold, criticized the hangman's technique, and adjusted the noose himself.